I want to take it to everybody. I appreciate you coming. I understand that everybody has a ton of information that they are gathering and sorting through at a lot of work. It's just taking time out of your busy schedule. So I genuinely appreciate your participation. The more information we have, the better choices and decisions we make. Maybe you can make the correct ones, and if not, at least we can correct those who don't have it. Thanks. Sit back and enjoy. Peter, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It has been, well, there's been a lot of crazy going on the last couple of years. And I got to say, this is kind of, can you hear me? It's kind of interesting for me because I usually live on the road 2/3 of the year. This is the first time I've put on a tie in 16 months. And I have like slept for 6 months in a row. It's fantastic. So part of me is a little nervous about getting back to the normal world. But then I was working on the book and I realized we're never going back. And that's not a COVID thing, that's a world thing. Now, the thing to understand about where we are right now, how we got here. COVID's a bit of the story, but only the most recent bit, and honestly, one of the least significant bits. In the world before World War II, everything was imperial. You had a series of sequestered, militarized systems. You only traded within your own network, and you shot at people who tried to do the same. It was a fight for everything. That eventually brought us World War II, which destroyed everything that we understood. And at the end of that war, the Americans drew our allies together and we said, you know, instead of doing this shoot 'em up style of international diplomacy, we're going to try something different. You're not allowed to have navies anymore. Our Navy, the only one that survived the war, is going to patrol the global oceans for everyone. We will protect your countries. We will allow you to send any civilian shipping anywhere in the world to interface with any market and any partner in any way, participate in any supply chain, export any good. In exchange, we want one thing. You are going to line up to fight the Soviets with us. Not behind us, not shoulder to shoulder with us, in front of us. We bribed up an alliance, and it worked. But the Cold War ended 30 years ago. And we've been backing away from that system ever since. And the guns for butter trade that we made back in 1945 arguably is no longer relevant. But let's assume for the moment that as Americans, this is something we want to preserve. Let's assume that for a second. What do we need? Well, we need three things. First, we need a bipartisan political system that agrees that the costs of maintaining a global network are worth the benefits. Now, I would argue that that evaporated long before Trump, even before Obama. But I think in the aftermath of January 6th, I think it's safe to say that we're not even really capable of having a political conversation right now. But let's assume for the moment that Biden is the guy. I think a lot of people have doubts about that, but let's just assume it for the moment. How long do you think it will take President Biden to get us all on the same page and to lead us back out in the world? It's like a 3-month thing? A 3-year thing? More time than he has? No, this is a generational transformation that needs to happen before we engage the world again. It can't happen this year or next year or probably this decade. So that's one. Number two, you need an economy that justifies that involvement. We've never had that, and that's by design. The United States is the least involved economy in the world as a percent of GDP, because if we were engaged, we would just be another empire and it wouldn't be a bribe. We pay people to be on our side, not the other way around. And then third, you would need a global military footprint to keep the peace. That's gone. This is total number of troops stationed abroad since World War II. It's been trending down for some time. This Middle East chunk goes to 0 in 5 weeks. Even if we were in agreement, even if we thought the costs were justified, we no longer have the military position to even try. It's done. It's over. We're in the transition to what's ever next. With that in mind, let's start with the first big idea, the one that is going to define the rest of our lives from a business point of view. Now, Since the time of the Columbus expeditions, human history, human economics have been based on the concept of more interaction, more integration, more trade, more finance, more financial penetration, more technological development, bigger markets, more. That ends in the first half of this decade. We do not have an economic model for a world of less. Not Marxism, not socialism, not fascism, not capitalism. We need to come up with something different, and we will not get it on the first try. And if you think back to the last several major conflicts, the German unification wars, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, underlying all of them was economic theory. We tend to argue about dollars and euros and yen and yuan. And so it's going to be a mess. Now, before World War II, the areas that were not shaded were where the economic dynamism tended to happen. Now, since World War II, that has changed. And one of the things we've seen is the areas that were shaded used to be the zones of conflict. Now, for those of you who know your history, that's where the world's major geopolitical and cultural tectonic plates slam together. And for those of you who know your economic history, you recognize that these are the zones since 1945 that have seen the greatest economic activity because the Americans forced everyone to be on the same side, and they were able to grow without conflict. It's base effect growth, but if you remove the Americans from the equation, it all breaks down. So we're looking at the pie getting smaller, at the same time the pie fractures. Now, I mentioned that we're entering a world of less, and to understand that, you need to understand demography. Now, this is Mexico. This is what we call a standard demographic profile. Children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top. Mortality tends to build it into a pyramid. Whenever you have a bulge in your pyramid below roughly age 40, about raising kids and buying cars and homes and going to college, that spending is what drives the modern system. And in most of the world, somewhere between 40 and 75% of all GDP comes from this sort of consumption-led activity. This is a partner. We like this. Young Mexicans are not very high on the value-added scale, so they do things that we're not good at, and vice versa. Integration for trade is fantastic. It's the most complementary economic partnership on the planet, and all those young people buy a lot of American products. So Mexico became our largest trading partner in calendar year 2019. 2020 data is a mess because of COVID. They're going to take that position back in 21 formally and probably never give it up in our lives. Partner. Not a partner. This is Korea. 50 years ago, they had a baby bust. They're running out of people. Now, the people they do have here at the top, this big bulge, people late 40s to early 60s, folks that literally have decades of expertise in their chosen field. Very productive, very high value added, going head to head with the American worker. But they have no consumption, so they have to export it. We will never have a trade surplus with a country that looks like this. Consumption-led, export-led. There's also an immigration angle. So here's Mexico zoomed up. Check this out. At roughly age 25, it drops off. You guys remember what happened 25 years ago in Mexico? They fully implemented NAFTA. Economic growth happened. People moved from the farms into the cities, from having kids running around doing farm labor, to all of a sudden being crammed into urban apartments. Birth rate dropped. Net migration from Mexico has now been negative for 11 years. It'll probably never turn positive again. So Mexico is facing something kind of like the Korea problem, but on a 30 to 45-year delay. Here's India. Teeming India, now the most populous country in the world, right? Same thing. It's happening everywhere. It's even happening in Central America. So we're a little obsessed these days with Central American migrant caravans crossing the border. Not for much longer. There aren't going to be many more people to worry about. So, from roughly 1985 to roughly 2015, we were kind of in the perfect moment. Demographics were all in balance. we had a mix of export-led systems like Korea today, consumption-led systems like Mexico today, and with the United States holding up the ceiling and ultimately the Cold War ending, everyone could trade with everyone else, and we saw the greatest expansions in trade, GDP, and personal incomes in the history of our species on a global scale. That's a long time. That's our entire professional lives. But it's the most abnormal period in human history. Now this is some of the major players back in 2000. But 20 years later, we are all 20 years older, and the moment has passed. The export-led systems are aging into mass retirement. The consumption-led systems are aging into export-led, but there's no one to export to. No matter what the United States does or thinks, globalization was going to end by the numbers because now the era of more is over. None of it works without mass consumption, without more and bigger. And we now have bare minimum 50 years of less. Probably a lot more, unless we figure out cloning or something. I mean, that's like the scale of what would need to be done. Global population, its current rate of decline is going to be less than 6 billion people by 2070. That assumes nothing goes wrong. Now, this is the US breakdown by generation, and I could practically write a book on each one of those color bars, but in the interest of time, we're only going to talk about one generation here, and that's the baby boomer generation. People who were born between World War II and 1965. Largest generation we have ever had as a percentage of the population, and they are responsible for the world we're in and the transition that we're going through right now. Two big things. First one is something that the boomers did that all the boomers around the world did. Key thing to remember is it's not just an American population cohort. The same thing that happened here happened elsewhere. After World War II, the GIs came home, they founded families, they founded the suburbs, they moved into their quarter-acre lots, they had a bunch of kids. Those kids are the boomers. And something similar happened in Australia and Britain and Japan and Korea and Germany, everywhere after the war. So it is the largest generation, not just here in the US, but globally. They were born at the same time, they went through adolescence at the same time, their adult lives were at the same time, and now they are retiring at the same time. Think about how you invest your personal money. When you're 35, your income's small. You can't afford to shave off too much for the future. When you're 55, your income is substantially larger. And you can afford not just to invest more in absolute terms, but in relative terms. So it's an exponential increase. And then when you're 64 and 7/8, every spare cent you have, you shove into that retirement account. And then you retire. And you never add to it again. In fact, you start whittling it down. This is average net worth in the United States. Oh, these are supposed to be by decades. I'm sorry, we had a data issue. So this is 35, 45, 55, 65, 75. As you age, it goes up. And the only reason it goes up between the 65ers and the 75ers is mortality. Household incomes combine as one person passes away in a couple. If it wasn't for that, it would drop substantially. Now, as you move up this scale, it's not just the numbers that change, it's the velocity of capital. Because as you approach retirement, you are looking to get every last increment of income you can, and a lot of people, as they near 65, realize they don't have enough put away, and so they start investing in things like Rwandan infrastructure bonds and Bitcoin. High velocity investments, a little risky, but then you retire and you cash it all out, and it turns into T-bills. So more money, higher velocity, more money, higher velocity, and a dead stop. That dead stop for the boomers, writ large, globally, happens next year. That's the year the majority of the boomers have retired. The US may have an ace in the hole, but it's not one we should probably really celebrate. Because this is everybody. Notice the scale, 300 at the top. This is everybody, including the 1%. I said that backwards, so sorry. This is everyone but minus the 1%. This is everyone with the 1%. Half of all financial assets in this country are held by the 1%. And if you factor them into the data, things get a little different. Number one, half of the total. Second, they invest differently, especially after retirement. When a 1%er retires, they have far more money than they need for their lifestyle. So they start transferring it to the next generation. That's why it starts to drop. The 99% have to keep their investments conservative, because if there's a currency crash or stock market crash, they're doomed. It's over. They're destitute. It doesn't happen with the 1%. They, on average, keep half to 2/3 of their total savings economically active in markets. And they start transferring to the lower generation where it can be put to productive use. So in the world we're going to, countries with large financial markets, a lot of wealth, and screaming inequality are partially immune to the capital crunch that's coming. Here, we're probably looking at tripling or quadrupling of capital costs within the next couple of years. In the rest of the world, it's going to be more, and it's going to last a lot longer. Why is it going to last longer? Yeah, here's everybody all together so you can just see the scale of it. Why is it going to last longer? Our demographics are different. Japan, China, Europe, they're past terminal. There is no recovery. It's just a question of how fast it all burns down. But American boomers did one thing different from everybody else around the world. They had kids. And the millennials are consumers today. And in 10 years, when they enter their 50s, they will be investors. So we've got 10 years of lean. With everybody else, it gets worse every single year for the rest of our lives. So that's the first big idea. Those of you who are financial advisors, there's lots of implications for you. Some are good, some are awful. Any questions before we launch into the Chinese? Okay, let's talk China. Problem number one, China's doomed. That's a short version. China in 10 years will not exist as a functional nation state, assuming it's a country at all. This is the Chinese demography back in 1950. This is right after World War II. They had a little baby bust as soon as the Japanese were no longer occupying them. You know, I'd celebrate too. You fast forward, however, to 1980, and Mao and his folks were thinking that there were just too many children because that boom had exploded. And this is the China that I think most of us still think of. The China that just has an endless, bottomless population of young people who can make anything for pennies on the dollar. But that's not accurate because the Chinese put in place the one-child policy. And if you fast forward to the 2000, you can see it took a huge bite out of their demography. Now, China at this time, in the year 2000, was kind of in this magic moment for a few years because the people who were born before one child were now in their 20s. So there's that bottomless labor. But they didn't have very many kids, which meant that all the money that they normally would have been spending on diapers and homes, they could spend on pizzas and convertibles. So China had rapidly growing economic activity, rapid urbanization. They urbanized at 7 times the pace that we did. They crammed 200 years of economic development into 40, which sounds really impressive until you realize that you can only do that once. And at the same time, they spent all their money on high impact consumption. No offense to those of you who are parents, but the velocity of capital that comes from going on vacation is higher than what you get from buying diapers, because it involves more people. It pushes it further. But again, you can only do that once. Here's China today. China, as of January 1st of this year, was the fastest aging society in human history. They're already past the point of no return for demographic recovery. And then we found out about 6 weeks ago that the Chinese, by China's own admission, had gotten the data wrong. Their birth rate has dropped by more than half in the last 5 years. And that's before you consider some of the genocidal policies they're doing in places like Xinjiang, where they're now party loyalists physically, permanently installed into each home to make sure that the husband and the wife do not sleep in the same bed so they can't have kids. In Xinjiang, the birth rates dropped by like 3/4 in just 2 years. We don't have a full counting of the data because it's Chinese data, but every aspect of it looks horrific by any definition. And this is now the best case scenario, because if you fast forward just to 2030, China in less than 15 years is going to have a greater proportion of retirees than any country in the world, including Japan. They're done. We're just watching them die at this point. And what do you know about politics when the old people are the ones calling all the shots? It gets brittle, it gets loud, it gets judgy, and it doesn't care at all about the facts. That's wolf warrior diplomacy. This is what a country looks like when it's going out of history. You can see it in some of the numbers. This is average wages in a number of countries in Southeast Asia that I'm broadly positive on. Here are the Mexicans right in the middle, hyper competitive. And here's the PRC. Labor costs have increased by about a factor of 12 in 20 years. It's the fastest labor inflation we've ever seen on this planet. China is no longer the cost or the low cost producer, and they haven't moved up the value added scale to become the high cost producer. 12-fold increase in labor, but their labor scale has probably only roughly doubled their productivity in 20 years. Their peak was probably around 2004 to 2006. Since then, they've been getting less efficient. And now we're in a situation where their labor pool will shrink substantially every year until the end. The strategic picture is much worse. The deep russet, those are densely populated areas. You'll notice, do I have a laser up here? I do not. You'll notice that up in northern China, north of Shanghai, that's where the bulk of the population is. That big russet blob up here, that's 70% of the Chinese population. Look at how they interact with the world. Their only way to push out to the ocean is to go between Japan and Taiwan. Does all their talk of reunification make a little bit more sense now? China is not a consumption-led system. They have to export. They have to access the wider world. And to do that, they have to sail between the two countries that are most pathologically opposed to them. The only way that China has ever been able to interact economically with the wider world is under the American-led globalized order, because we put everybody in this part of the world on the same side. All the Americans have to do, if the goal really is to destroy China, is go home. Geography will take care of the rest. The lights will probably go out first. The green bars over here are where the oil comes from. The red bars over here are where the oil goes to. They're a convenient 6,000 miles apart. So for China to import oil, 80% of its oil needs, it has to sail by Vietnam, who hates them, by Indonesia and Malaysia, who hate them, by Singapore, which has an aircraft carrier berth designed for American and Japanese carriers, by India, who really hates them, and then it can get to the Persian Gulf and it can have all kinds of fun in the Middle East, just like we did. Remember, the Chinese have one aircraft carrier. It's a clone of a Soviet carrier that was designed in the 60s. That's it. Now, the Shandong, their carrier, we have 10 that are the same size. And in addition to our 10 carrying twice as many fighter craft, they also have 3,000 Marines on board. So 10 to 1. And those aren't what we call carriers. Those are what we call our amphibious assault units. We then have super carriers, 12 of them, that have 7 times the combat capability of the Shandong. So in just aircraft carriers, you're talking here like a 40 to 1 ratio. And we don't have to sail by any enemies to go wherever we want in the world. We're blue water capable. They are not. In fact, the Shandong is such a piece of crap that it cannot sail more than 500 miles from shore, and it needs fighter cover from the ground onshore in order to survive in any sort of conflict. There's no contest here. The Japanese, by the way, can probably outshoot them on the deep blue sea by about a factor of 25 to 1. Let's not just us. Let's talk trade. Now, the guy on the left, this is Robert Lighthizer. Under Donald Trump, he was our trade representative. It was his job to initiate, negotiate, and enforce every trade deal on the books. And he has a reputation, which I think he would be proud of being a complete hard ass. He doesn't negotiate. He gets political cover from his boss. That's the only way he takes the job. He did this under Reagan, too. He lays out the American position, and it's a take it or leave it. And it was this attitude that got the trade deals with Korea and Japan and Mexico and Canada. He started deals with the United Kingdom, but when he laid out the deals for the US, the UK, they went paler than normal and went home because the entire Brexit program has not worked out the way that they thought it was going to. They'll be back, but he wasn't able to finish that one up. His replacement is this woman. This is Catherine Tai, and she has never participated in international negotiation at all, nor led a negotiation, even in the United States. So from the point of view of initiating and negotiating trade deals, she's widely unqualified for the job. But that tells me everything I need to know about the Biden team's trade policy. There isn't one. It's not a priority. Mexico and Canada are two of our top 3 trading partners. Japan's number 4, Korea's number 6. The hard work's done. Her job is enforcement, and for that, she's freaking perfect. She's a trade lawyer. She sues countries that violate US trade law, whether it's internationalized or not. She's suing Mexico and Canada right now because Mexico and Canada thought that now that Trump was gone, they can kind of go back on what they were forced into. She's like, oh, no. And so we've got these fun things going on in trade policy with Tai because, she's a Democrat. So environmental and labor regulations, female rights, all that, it's being folded into trade policy for the first time. And she's already sued China 7 times this year. It's getting kind of interesting. She's applying these new values retroactively to the phase 1 trade deal. That's fun. And there's a few things going on supporting this kind of echelon approach to trade. So you guys may remember that Donald Trump on his last day in office had 2 big policy changes versus the Chinese. First, he said what was going on in Xinjiang was a genocide because, it is. And second, he said that any American diplomat or military officer or bureaucrat can travel to Taiwan at any time in their official capacity as a representative of the US government without having to first get special dispensation from the White House, which is about that far from formal recognition of Taiwan as an independent country, because it is an independent country. On Joe Biden's first day in office, he put a stamp of approval on both policies and made it bipartisan. Like one of the few things we agree on. In his first week on the job, he sent 2 aircraft carrier battle groups, one of the big ones and one of the ones with the Marines in it, to go practice amphibious assaults in the South China Sea. That was fun. They did it within sight of some of the Chinese military facilities. Within sight, that's like 4 miles. Catherine Tai, her family, they're from Taiwan. The Chinese perceive this as a full court press against their interests, and they're not wrong. Donald Trump had America first. Joe Biden has Buy American. They're not that different. One of the fun things about Donald Trump is he'd come up with his policy on China. He'd bring in the bureaucrats who would be responsible for implementing it. He'd lay out what he wanted to do, and when they were on their way out the door, he'd fire them. Joe Biden does the same thing, but at the end, he gives them a raise. So basically, what we're getting is the rhetoric of Donald Trump actually operationalized into trade policy now. So whether you love Trump or hate Trump, he did break the bubble around globalization and trade, and Biden's just ramming it home. Different stationery, same policy. And it's going to get really fun real soon. There's any number of reasons that the relationship is in bad shape right now. But the debate within the White House right now is what level of boycott are we going to do in February for the Beijing Games? If we have a boycott, a full boycott, like a Soviet-style boycott, and the athletes don't go, the Chinese will feel that they have no choice but to react. Because you know, the American corporate sponsors in that environment have to pull their sponsorship. So, you know, Nike, Airbnb, United, the big guys. If they do that, Beijing will confiscate every asset they have in the mainland. And any American company that is still operating in the mainland will then be targeted by their competitors as sponsors of the genocide games. An easy PR play. And that's the end of the relationship. I mean, that could very well happen this year. The European Parliament today voted almost unanimously to support a full boycott. Fun times. Okay, anyone want to talk about China before we jump on to inflation? Because that's almost as crazy. Yes, please. Oh, yeah, microphone.
Okay.
There you go.
I'll get it figured out. Given the demographics in China and what's going to happen over the next, say, 10 years, at what point does that have implications for the Chinese financial markets and it become a potential short opportunity in terms of the decline in their equity markets?
Something to keep in mind when you're talking finance. And this can go any number of directions, and I could probably talk to you about an hour and still not cover all the caveats. But if we're moving into an environment from hyper availability of capital to hyper shortage of capital, you should also expect rancid levels of capital controls and capital flight. As long as it's yuan denominated, and 99% of the yuan supply is locked up in the mainland, any investments in the mainland, as far as I'm concerned, are like going to Macau and gambling. Not based on fundamentals. With capital controls, you won't get anything out. The Chinese have already taken remarkable steps to limit the ability of their own people to move money abroad, but they can't plug all the holes fast enough. So we're still talking like $1 trillion a year of capital flight for each of the last 10 years. At some point, foreign money that is in the country is going to face exactly the same problem, which means you can't short a market with capital controls. You have to think back to before 1971 when the capital controls were basically banished. That's the world. Some version of that world is probably what we're going back to, which means that any sort of international investment without an investment treaty is at a degree of risk of just going to zero. And in a broader scale, if you look back to the world before World War II, it was the fate of 99% of financial markets to go to zero at some point. We're not used to that in the era of fiat money, but we're going to get used to it good and hard pretty soon. So me personally, I don't invest in the PRC. Please.
All right, so Alan asked, what are your thoughts on long-term implications of crypto and government regulations?
We're going to talk about crypto in the next section. Yes, this section. But we'll get to that in a minute. Crypto. Yeah. Okay, let's start with COVID because we kind of have to. The original coronavirus variant out of Wuhan had an R0, number of people who are normally infected, of 3 to 4 based on your specifics of your environment. That made it about 3 times as communicable as the flu. That's one of the reasons why the maskings and the social distancing, while working okay against COVID, obliterated the flu. We had 98% reduction in flu cases last winter. I mean, that's brilliant. Makes it hard to figure out what you're going to do for the vaccine this year, but you know, as it is. So we have 4 new variants that have boiled up since roughly Thanksgiving. The Alpha variant, or the British variant, is scary enough, about 70 to 80% more communicable. It's also more likely to infect people between age 20 and 40 and put them in a hospital. Significant change from the original strain. The Beta variant in South Africa, in my opinion, in the long term is the worst one because it's cross-communicable with mice and rats, which means no human settlement anywhere on the planet will ever be rid of this. We will all need boosters forever. The Gamma variant scares the hell out of me. This is the one that bypasses naturally occurring immunity. So you can get COVID again and again and again because it gets around its own naturally gained immunity. But the one everybody's screaming about right now is the Indian variant, the Delta variant, because it is nearly twice as communicable as the Alpha, and it has a lot of aspects of the Gamma. This is the one that is currently the majority of cases in the United States, and it's spreading like wildfire through any unvaccinated population, wherever it happens to be. Now, for you guys in the South specifically, you should be very worried, very worried about this, because you're in air conditioning season. You're clustered together to evade the heat and the humidity. Perfect conditions for COVID. It actually spreads more quickly in drier conditions than humid conditions, and ACs are designed to create the perfect environment for it. So in the South, this summer could be really rough. I'm really worried about what's going to happen in August. And then when we get to winter, it'll be the North's turn. But the North has better vaccination rates. And some places in New England are already above 80%. In Alabama, you're not yet to 40. If you decide you want to force the issue as an employer, Supreme Court has already weighed in. You can force your employees to get it. But you might want to take some informal polls before you do it, because you can't like force it on these guys. But if this person says, nah, you can't just let go half of them. Food for thought. Anyway, here in the United States, despite our unequal vaccine applications, we are arguably one of the 3 most vaccinated populations in the world. And the economy is reopening. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm itching to go out. I actually fly out of the country tomorrow for my first vacation in 2 years. I'm freaking excited. I've had to pay a lot more than I normally would have to, because we're all doing it at the same time. We're all going to restaurants at the same time and going to road trips on the same time and doing updates on our house for the same time, because we've been locked up in our house for over a year. We're seeing the fastest economic growth we have seen in the history of this country. Right now, it's going to accelerate through the second half of the year. We are demanding everything. And since collectively the American population has $20 trillion in cash more than it did before the virus arrived, we have the money to pay for the premium. Inflation, it's unavoidable. And if you fast forward to the world that I see coming, it'll get a lot worse for some things. This is where the world's iron ore comes from right now, mostly from the Southern Hemisphere. Now, if you remember that global conflict map I showed you, you'll remember that these are the zones where the shooting is going to get exciting. That's not where the iron ore comes from, or where the bauxite comes from, or where the copper comes from, or where the lithium comes from. Almost all the raw materials we use in modern life come from the Southern Hemisphere. But you don't use raw lithium or iron ore. You have to refine it into lithium metal and into steel. And that happens somewhere else. Germany, Ukraine, Russia, Japan, Korea, China, those are the world's 6 largest steel exporters. They are in the conflict zones. So while the raw material will remain accessible, it's the finished product that we use that will be a problem. Now, once you have the raw material for any of these things, what's the single biggest cost factor in turning it into something that's useful? Electricity. And courtesy of the shale revolution, the United States has the cheapest electricity in the world without even using the subsidy system. We have 17 steel foundries under construction in the United States right now that will all be operational within the next 9 months. Prices are sending us in that direction before we have a global supply shock. One of the ironic, great things about coronavirus is it exposed to a lot of companies at various levels of the supply chain where their vulnerabilities were, and they're fixing them. And it's not costing them nearly as much as they thought it was going to be. Between the American workforce, the American educational system, the proximity of Mexico, a recession in Canada, and the shale revolution, production costs for any manufactured product are cheaper in North America than they are in East Asia. The only reason that East Asia is still doing it is because of the sunk cost of the actual capital investment in the first place. Now, you can't unwind that overnight, but under coronavirus, we spent 1.5 years working on it. So the United States has actually become less wired into international trade in the last 1.5 years, especially if you consider North America as a unit, which I think we should. Let's talk manufacturing. This is where it all comes from. So this 155 in the middle, that's total value added of all manufacturing in the United States in calendar year 2019. Can't do 2020 right now because it's all over the place. But $1.555 trillion. All the arrows indicate where the value added components are that contribute to that 155. They're color coded for their likelihood of disruption, and the numbers are in billions of US dollars. So green should be okay. Yellow, figure 25% of it's not going to make it, make other plans. Orange, you're kind of hosed, that's half. And if it's in red, just write it off completely. Now, in the United States, our two biggest partners are Mexico and Canada, and that's green. There's a lot of green, there's a lot of yellow, there's no red. I don't mean to suggest that we are immune to what is coming, but the exposure is limited. We can grow through it, particularly with some help from our neighbors. The Germans can't. They face two problems. One, they're far more integrated with the wider world, both in absolute and in relative terms. And two, because their demographics are terminal, because Europe's demographics are terminal, they need access to the wider world, not just to get the value-added components in, but to get the finished product out. This model does not work at all. And some German companies have seen the writing on the wall. There's a reason that the biggest Volkswagen plant in the world is in Mexico. They're trying to relocate as much of their value-added production to the Western Hemisphere as they can, while they can. And if the Germans are in trouble, well, then the Chinese are utterly screwed. Nothing that is value-added is made in China. Half of the value-added capacity for plastics and cement happens outside of the country. It's over 90% for telecoms equipment, electronics, and computers. They're the king of the low end. They're the emperor of assembly. And that's not unimportant, but that is really easy to relocate somewhere else. And so it is being. It's just the question is where. Vietnam's picking up some, India's picking up some, Mexico is having the time of its life. And a lot of it's coming here too. Now, when you do assembly in China, you do assembly in the United States, it looks different. We're more likely to automate, but there's still a lot of weird crossovers in a lot of these sectors. So like take computing, for example. There's a lot of computing assembly that requires fingers and eyes. And American fingers and eyes are just too finicky and too expensive. You can't automate that. Mexico's great at that. So we've got this weird mix in the market where the really high-end assembly and computing is going to Mexico, but the mid-end stuff that can be automated, yeah, we'll do that. It's kind of weird, but yeah, it works. Let's talk about a few sectors real quick. The 6 sectors that are relocating most quickly. The first one is wiring. And you know, that's not something that we have done in this country since the 60s. Now, what normally happens with wiring is you get the raw ore, you smelt it into metal, you get an ingot, you send the ingot somewhere where it's melted down and pulled into wire. That wire as a spool, like this, is then sent to a final manufacturing location where it's unspooled, mixed with other wires, built into wiring harnesses, and then put into the vehicle or the computer or whatever. So here in this country, it's only that last step that we do as part of terminal manufacturing, the final step. But the United States is now getting back into primary metals in a big way. Why ship the intermediate pieces away? So as steel plants are coming back, as copper plants are coming back, we're even starting to fiddle with aluminum a little bit. We're going to see more of that middle step coming back. Again, it'll look different. It won't be done by hand as much. But this entire sector is likely to be North American centric moving forward because it's where the metal comes from, and it's where the finished product comes from. Textiles is a weird one. With automation, we can now create thread, turn it into yarn, weave it into cloth, cut it into sections, sew it into clothes, cheaper here than Bangladeshis can do it by hand. All it takes is the industrial investment, which is not that expensive. So any place in the United States that makes synthetic fiber, Gulf Coast, any place in the United States that has cotton, Carolinas, Deep South, can move into this space and basically take over the entire global industry. Other fun fact, a lot of this sector is really shattered. The cotton's in one place, the thread is in another, the yarn is in a third, the cutting's in another place, the clothes are in another, and then the finishing is in a fifth. There's no need to do that with automation. You can put it all in the same place. Now again, the jobs will look differently. And a modern textile mill like this, No, that's a 2-acre facility in North Carolina. It has a staff of 2. This is not 1,000 people at a loom anymore. These are software engineers. Electronics. You want to employ 3 million people, this is what you go for. This is fax machines. This is old style phones. This is stereo speakers. This is hardtop computers. What you need to make this sort of manufacturing work is a variety of different types of workers. The high end, the mid end, the low end. And you need them as close as physically possible. Most countries in the world can't pull that off. We're not particularly equal. And Mexico's right next door. We're perfect for this. And unlike automotive or computing, where it's a highly automated process with a relatively known number of workers, there are steps of this that are very labor intensive on the high end and on the low end. This is how you change your employment profile. You can see that from over here. What is that? That's computing. Okay, we already talked about the assembly side. One of the things to keep in mind about computing is it's like the anti-electronics. It's very, very concentrated, and it's a clean room issue. Every step of the process, from melting of the silicon metal, pulling it into a crystal, slicing it into wafers, doping and etching and baking, breaking them up into chips, turning those into semiconductors, that all happens under one roof. It's all clean room work. And you can't have a clean room truck chain to take it to different labor points. So when these are built, they are intended to be there for their entire life cycle, 20, 30 years. They'll upgrade the equipment as they go, but they're not going to like tear it down and split it up. COVID changed the math. What's going on in the auto industry right now with the chip shortage is changing the math. We have 9 of these under construction in the United States right now. The first 2 will come on operation in Phoenix within a year and a half. Automotive, I'll admit it's kind of sexy. In terms of manufacturing, it's the biggest value add in the world. Your average internal combustion vehicle has 3,000 parts. Your average 30,000 parts. Your average EV still has 5,000. The value-added capacity for small and especially medium-sized businesses is massive. All they require is a degree of co-location. If you can have different price points for the labor, that's ideal. It's not necessarily required, not like it is for electronics. Now, Texas, because it's got that interchange with Mexico, owns a lot of this. But Alabama's at the southern end of Auto Alley, and that is no laughing matter. Do we have any folks in Mississippi here? Mississippi. Mississippi's getting in on this. Mississippi, as you guys know, the labor force isn't as sophisticated. It's a lower price point, but some of those areas in central Mississippi, central eastern Mississippi, are integrating with the Birmingham area in automotive because it's close enough. And this is the kind of thing that Trump made a big difference in. One of the clauses in NAFTA 2 is that 85% of the value-added components that are in a North American sold automobile have to be manufactured here. And because we already have massive network effects, both in Texas and in Auto Alley, it's really easy to add that incremental next piece if you can get the price right. Mississippi has the right price. Heavy machinery is kind of like automotive in that there's a lot of pieces that go into it. It tends to be a differentiated supply chain. But because not everyone needs a steamroller, it's not as spread out. Now, when the United States allowed when the United States allowed China to join the World Trade Organization in the year 2000, this entire sector, whether it was for farm equipment, manufacturing equipment, construction equipment, or mining equipment, the whole thing moved over to China. So if we do have a split in relations, I hope you have the heavy equipment that you need, because it's going to be 2 or 3 years before that can retool. And there aren't as many places in American automotive that can handle heavy machinery because it's not what they were designed for. You need to be able to move around really big chunks of metal. Houston can do that, but they can't do that and continue to excel at automotive at the same time. They need more industrial plant. So if you are in the need for a heavy truck or a combine, you might want to speed up that purchase, because this, while it is being retooled and it is coming back, one of the Trump's things, 80% has to be done here. It's not moving as quickly because not everybody needs one until they do. We also have the greatest internal migration going on in this country's history, or at least since World War II. Now, this is not a population density map. This is an urban expansion map. So any city in green can physically expand in any direction without restriction. You move into blue, they're blocked in one or two directions. By the time you get down to red, they physically cannot expand at all. So for example, Dallas-Fort Worth can just sprawl like a lesion across northern Texas, whereas San Francisco is completely blocked in by ocean and mountain. If you're in red, the only way to expand and add people is to move up. If you're in green, you can go out, and going out costs 1/10 as much on the whole. So blue and green can expand, orange and red can't. That explains housing values for the most part. A lot of other things going on. First of all, baby boomers don't want to shovel snow when they retire. They move where it's warmer. Millennials want to raise kids and not in an efficiency apartment in the Castro. They're moving where there's more room and where it's cheaper, where they can have an actual house. Suburbs are great. Third, because of COVID, no one wants to be on the subway. The cities with circles are dependent upon mass transit. We used to think that of as a plus. Right now, not so much. That means that we have a lot of citizen mobility that is moving to the Mountain West, the Southwest, and the South. Roughly half of our urban centers are losing people, and half of them are gaining people. Isn't that wash? But if you guys remember what happened after the financial crisis, we stopped building homes for 3 years. We entered COVID with fewer free residences than at any time in our history. We're down to 800,000 nationwide. It's gone down since then. Because we had 3 months at the beginning of COVID where no one built anything. So we have half the population in some degree of motion concentrated on half of the metro regions. At the same time, we have housing shortages on a national basis. I live just outside of Denver, and in my neighborhood, property prices have doubled since COVID started. Same things happen in Austin, where I moved from. Wish I would have hung onto that house for a couple years. All right, let's talk cash. One of the fun things about life in the current, here's my water, in the current era is that we're making it up as we go. So when people criticize the Federal Reserve, I'm like, come on, cut them a break. We've never been at something like this before. So a bit of a backstory. If you go back to the dawn of time, every successful currency was based on an asset, usually gold, sometimes silver, combination of the two, copper, whatever it happened to be. So you'd have your currency, it would be backed up by some sort of physical currency, or physical asset, either in the form of a coin or in a safe somewhere. That's what those of us with a British or a German ancestry, which is going to be most of you, think of as normal and good and solid. And this whole fiat era, we're a little queasy about. But there's one thing that all of those successful currencies had in common. They failed, every single one of them. And they all failed for the same reason. If you have a successful currency, you encourage exchange. You encourage differentiation and labor diversity. You encourage economic growth and trade. You encourage people to use your currency as a store of value. It's more and more and more. And eventually you run out of the metal. So you have to physically expand your empire to get more. And then you start making decisions for your country based on where you can get the metal as opposed to what makes strategic sense. Rome had to go south of the Sahara. The Brits had to have a global empire where they fought with everyone. And all of them collapsed because of the success of their currency. When the world wars rolled around, it's not just that the Americans were the last ones standing. We were the last ones to come to the party. And we told all the allies, we will supply you with anything you need so long as you pay us in gold. And in the 2 world wars, we emptied out the planet of every scrap of free precious metals that had been mined since the dawn of time. Yeah. And then we launched the order. And we had the greatest expansion in economic activity, the greatest period of peace and prosperity in human history. And within 30 years, all the gold in the world wasn't enough. And And so Nixon nixed the gold standard, and the value of the US dollar is based on nothing more than Tricky Dick saying, trust me. That's the world we're in now. We can't go back. The metal doesn't exist. Every currency in the world, directly or indirectly, is based on the US dollar, and the US dollar is based on the full faith and credit of the United States. We're in unknown territory. We have been for almost 50 years. And I think the Fed's done a pretty good job. This is the M2 money supply. From 2000 until 2019, the total money supply roughly tripled. Global GDP increased by roughly a factor of 2. Is that too much? You can make that argument, but it's not egregious. Our only, oops, sorry, let me go back. This is QE1, this is QE2, and that's coronavirus. You know, these aren't very big, and there was a lot going on for this one. Perfect? No. Will that have complications down the line? Probably. Will we enjoy those complications? Probably not. But perspective is important. Here's the yuan, here's the yen, Japan, that's the orange, and the euro, gray. Neither of these are global currencies. The Japanese are one of the more heavily manipulated currencies. It's like we're responsible for something like 1.5% of global currency reserves and has almost vanished from international trade. The euro is responsible for 15 to 20% based on which country you're looking at. And ever since the Europeans started confiscating insured bank deposits to pay for the bank bailout so that the taxpayer wouldn't have to, everyone who could get their money out of Europe did. And yet, at a number of times in recent memory, their money supplies have surpassed that of the United States, despite the fact that they're not a global store of value, they're not a local store of value, and they are not trade currencies. That's what bad currency policy in the fiat age looks like. But before you judge the Japanese and the Europeans too harshly, let's redraw this. Here are those three again, and here's China. In an average month, the Chinese print over 5 times the amount of currency that the Federal Reserve does, despite the fact that 99% of the yuan is held within the mainland and most of the rest is in Hong Kong. Not an open system. All for an economy that's, even by the most aggressive estimates, a third smaller than the US economy. So try not to be too harsh on Mr. Powell. He's got a hard job. And he thinks he's part of a legacy of people who broadly have an idea of what they're doing. And if you think that what the US is doing is inflationary, and that means you should put your money in Bitcoin, oh, baby. So, Bitcoin. No intrinsic value, not backed by a government. One of its selling points is it's available in limited supply. Not a currency of exchange. You can't pay things for it. You can't liquidate it whenever you want to. And 85% of it is mined in China with coal power, meaning that if there's carbon taxes, it has a net negative value. And the people doing the mining are doing it to get money out of Americans so they can get around sanctions. Oh, of course it's going to go to zero. Think of Bitcoin like Vegas. If you enjoy trading it, great. Just know that most people will not get their money back. Good times. Okay, so fastest economic growth in the history of the country. We're going to top 10% annualized this year. Everybody's itching to get out. The Federal Reserve is on a record expansion, which is nothing compared to the expansion we're seeing in the rest of the world. We have relocations. We have shortages in housing, in lumber, in steel, in aluminum, in precious metals, in electronics. We have hiccups in the supply chain that cannot adjust fast enough. We are going to have inflation in the last half of this year that is absolutely going to be higher than what we had in the early 80s, probably faster than what we had in the 70s. And that assumes that relations with the Chinese do not implode. If that happens, we're talking about World War II levels of inflation or more. Now, in the words of the Fed, this is transitory. You only move to Texas once. You only have to build a house once. You only have to move your supply chain once. But when they say transitory, unless they're lying to themselves, we're not talking here 6 to 12 months. We're talking 24 to 36, because this just takes time. Now, on the back end of that, we will have a disinflationary, not deflationary, disinflationary period where things kind of settle, and we'll have a more stable supply chain system that is mated with our labor force, which is mated with our energy costs because of shale, and it will all be much smoother. And at that same time, the Mexicans will have had a nice kick, and we'll enter the new era together on a much more stable footing. But the road from here to there has a lot of potholes and a lot of twists and turns, and that, of course, assumes that the Chinese go quietly into this good night. I'm going to be busy, and anyone who wasn't in this room to see this is going to be freaking out. So for those of you who are in the world of finance, you're going to have a lot of fun with that kind of understanding, I think. Because the panic in the markets as this all breaks down, as capital costs shoot up and everything moves around, you now at least have a bit of a roadmap. But I don't speak to really big groups. So have fun. Okay, anything on inflation before we talk politics? Please.
So Shelley asked, given the assessment of the Chinese Navy, how do you feel about the recent computer-modeled war games wherein the United States military said China won and it was really fast?
Yes, okay. So what the Chinese military does is they don't count on their Navy in the traditional sense. So the US Navy is designed for long-range power projection and to keep the sea lanes open. That's not what the Chinese have done. They realize that they can't go head-to-head with the American Navy. So what they've done is a twofold thing. Number one, large number of land-based assets that launch short to medium range missiles by the dozens, cruise missiles primarily. And then second, they have those same missiles on naval platforms, so they sail them a few hundred miles from shore and then send them out. The idea behind that war game is that the guidance from the president has not changed from what it was originally laid down in 1987. And that is the US is the sole naval power, and the Navy has the right to prance wherever it wants at any time, in any volume. So every one of these war games, say the US Navy gets its ass handed to them, they're basically within sight of the Chinese mainland, which is idiotic in an actual conflict. If it does come to a war with Beijing, and I don't think it will, we'll just send a few destroyers into the Indian Ocean and interrupt their supply line for oil, and the whole country will collapse within 2 months. The Navy knows this, but that doesn't get you funding. So we have these war games where they get annihilated, and then all of a sudden, oh, it's a new carrier. That's basically the story. Now, there's a complication in there, and that is completely down to American diplomatic strategy, which is, let's just say, in flux. So the US can destroy China easily. But what about Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, you know, the countries that we historically have aligned ourselves with during the Cold War and the years since? If we care about them, maybe we should do a little bit more. But I think the American population has just decided that they're done for now. And these countries are on their own. Now, in a straight one-on-one war, I have no doubt that the Japanese can wipe the floor with the Chinese on the Deep Blue Sea. The problem is that Japan is not in the Deep Blue Sea. It's just off the coast within range of all of those missiles. So if it does come to a fight between Japan and China direct, the Japanese are going to bleed a lot, but the Chinese will be gone. Because if you start launching scores of cruise missiles into population centers, because unlike the United States, unlike China, Japanese population centers are in very small footprints. They're military facilities and economic facilities and physical infrastructure and densely populated condos all in the same spot. They don't have a lot of flat land. And so if you're going to go after the military, you basically have to take out the cities. And that means you're killing millions of people. China will never recover from that diplomatically, globally. And Japan would feel 100% justified in striking back however they felt. And I don't know if you guys have met a lot of Japanese in your life. They're wicked smart. And they could probably develop a deliverable nuke in about 4.5 hours. And once we get to that stage of the conflict, the conversation changes dramatically. Yeah.
Bernard would like to know your thoughts on China's control over key supplies, such as chip shortages, rare earth metals, and PPP, as well as the supply chain disruptions.
Okay, three very different answers. Let's start with PPP. PPP is really low-grade technology that was developed in the 1950s. The only reason we don't do it here is because it's cheaper to do it somewhere else. The technology is known. It's not expensive to put into place. Unfortunately, the facilities that do the masks are about 3 times the size of this room for one of them. It takes 4 months to put them in. Now, I've given Trump a couple of props on trade strategic policy. Time to take him down a notch. Oh my God. It's like he knew what COVID was going to do in February. Certainly knew in March. Absolutely knew in August. He didn't buy one. I mean, that was low-hanging fruit if there ever was one. Anyway, easy to get in if the decision is made. PPP, rare earths. Don't worry. Rare earths are a byproduct of any number of metal development processes. So the ore is not rare. It's called a rare earth because it's difficult to process. Not technically difficult, just chemically difficult. You have to go through a series of several hundred acid baths to purify each individual one, and that takes a few months. But there's nothing about it that's difficult. It was designed in the 1920s. Now, when the Chinese first threatened the Japanese 11 years ago with a rare earth cutoff, 2 things happened. Number one, the Japanese figured out how to get by with 80% less in less than 6 weeks. Like, the Chinese were subsidizing production, so we all had access to all the rare earths we could want. The industry of the world adjusted around that. As soon as the Chinese said something at all, we were all like, ho, 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 ho. No, sir. So we figured out how to do with less. Every phone you have, every laptop you have, you know how they don't have those worrying hard drives anymore? That means they don't have very many rare earths in them anymore. So it pushed us in a new technological direction to get around that. Second, we started implementing 1920s technology in places like Australia and Malaysia and France and Texas. So there's more than enough physical capacity around the world to take over should the Chinese actually pull the plug. But as long as the Chinese are subsidizing it for everybody else, no one feels the need to spin up a facility. So if push does come to shove and the Chinese stuff does fall off the market, it's going to take 6 to 9 months to spin all that up, and then we'll be fine. And every person, every company that uses rare earths in volume already has like a year's supply in preparation for this. So it really is a hollow threat. And what was the third one? Chips? Sure. Okay. So the really, really, really crappy chips, the ones that you put into a smart spatula, the Chinese do those. The medium end chips, the ones you put into a car, that's Thailand and Malaysia. And the high end ones that go into your laptops and your smartphones, that's Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. Now, one of the things, in my opinion, that both Trump and Biden have gotten wrong is we only want the good stuff. So we're going to put $300 billion behind a program to get the high-end chips back to the United States. I mean, that's all fine and technological leadership and blah, blah, blah. That doesn't solve the car problem. It's like we're not having a problem with the high-end chips. That's just kind of an ego thing. So if we want to maintain the supply chain with automated EVs and automotive, we need to keep some sort of positive relationship with either the Malaysians or the Thais, preferably both, or find a way to build them in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the US has the technological capacity to do it. We're not very competitive because of the cost point, and the Mexicans don't have the precision educational system that's necessary to build out their own. So that would probably cost more than the $300 billion that Biden is putting behind the high-end stuff. Because the high-end stuff, we're the country that designs these things. We know how to do it. We just choose to split up the labor pool because of cost purposes. Can't really do that with the mid-end stuff. You're just going to have to pay for it. Russia and China.
I said, I'm curious, what is the relationship between Russia and China? Because you talk about China's Navy, but then I think Russia has a fairly substantial Navy. And so, okay, well, it's good to know.
When the Soviet system collapsed, the Russians were never a world-class naval power. They had some fun naval technology, especially with those mid-range cruise missiles, which I'm glad we never were on the receiving end of. but they really have built very, very few hulls since then. The Kursk disaster, if you remember that back in 2001, that was the only ship of size that they had built since the Cold War ended. Now, they have a few others, but they're crap. And so what the Russians did is they fell into their own ideology. We'll talk about this a little bit later. And they started believing that the United States cared about them. And in the aftermath of the Cold War, we really don't. So they cause problems for us wherever we can. We're always like, we're in Iran. Why are you here? We're in Bolivia. Why are you here? Well, to that end, they started sharing technology with the Chinese. And the Chinese did, they always do. They buy the floor model, they reverse engineer it, and anything they can do themselves, they do. And then the Russians lose their tech edge. So there's very little that the Russians can do anymore technologically that the Chinese can't match. And what few bits are left, they're still selling. So it's kind of a starvation diet. Now, the Russians and the Chinese do have one thing in common. That neither of them really like us very much. And as long as the United States is involved in the world, they will be on the same side, broadly speaking, diplomatically speaking, against us. But if the US steps back, they hate each other so much. The Russians in the past have conquered like the northeastern quarter of the country. They fought a brief war back in the 60s, which led to this, Soviet split. Under Yeltsin, they said publicly, feel free to try and take Siberia and all those resources. We can't defend it. We don't have enough people. We're just going to nuke you. They don't get along. And with the United States pulling back, a lot of these mutual antagonisms are going to start boiling up again. So they should enjoy their good relations while they have them. Yes.
Peter would like to know, if electric cars are the future, where will the industry find the lithium?
Yeah, well, I don't want to say that electric cars aren't the future, but lithium-powered electric cars are not the future. For those of you who remember your chemistry class from way back when, you would know that a lithium atom has only 3 atoms. Sorry, a lithium atom only has 3 electrons, 2 of which are locked into a lower orbit shell and cannot move. So there's 1 free electron per atom. That makes it the least energy dense material on the planet, but one of only 2 that we know how to manipulate at that level. That's the only reason we're using it. Cobalt's much better. It has other complications, but we really need a new physical battery chemistry before we can talk about mass electrification of the transport sector. Put that to the side for the moment. Let's assume that I'm wrong and it's all lithium all the time. Most of the world's lithium either comes from Australia or Chile, and there are secondary deposits in Bolivia and Argentina. So they kind of follow the same math for steel and iron ore. It's mined in a place that's safe, it's processed in a place that's not. I would suggest that the processing is going to reshore to the United States.
Bernard has another question. Auto manufacturing is losing $100 billion this year due to chip shortages. Are there any quick fixes?
No. You have to build the facilities, and that takes time. Like a really cheap fab facility, like of the Chinese variety, is still $4 billion. The high-end ones, like the Intel facility down in Phoenix, that's like 15. Yeah, there's no quick way around that. Sorry. Yeah, it's like we retooled during COVID away from automotive towards consumer electronics, and they're trying to retool back, but you just can't move it that fast. I think we're all a little surprised at how fast we've emerged from lockdown in the last 2 months. Imagine doing that for a fab. It's because they can't start until they know where it's going. Now they know, give them 6 months. Okay, we got to go on. Do politics. Okay. Republicans and Democrats are evolving. So I think it's better to look at the factional makeup of the parties rather than to look at what we've come to think of as the normal alliances. So I like this matrix for that. If you're down at the bottom, you want the government to play some sort of role in regulating social norms. If you're at the top, you want the government out of your personal life. If you're over here, you think that the government should increase the tax take to remake society in some way. And if you're over here, you want the government out of your wallet. And we're all on this matrix somewhere. So for example, if you're down in this corner, social conservative but an economic liberal, it's guns, God, and Medicare. And if you're at the top left, an economic conservative and a social liberal, you think all of the country's bureaucrats should get together in Washington, D.C., and make the world's biggest nuclear weapon and set it off while they're there. Okay. Here's our traditional swing voters going back to the 1920s. Here is what we've come to think of as the Democratic coalition. Here are the Republicans. Here's everyone together. The single biggest impact that Donald Trump had on the American political spectrum is he elevated one faction that had almost vanished from American politics, the populace of the right. And based on whose numbers you're using, he brought 10 to 20 million voters in who had not participated in the last 4 or 5 presidential elections. Mobilized all of them. And to think that they're just simply going to vanish now that he's not president, I think is silly. Because they are now the single largest voting bloc, not in the Republican coalition, in the country. And they've had a taste of power, and they are not going back. But for everyone that Donald Trump brought in, he drove others away. The national security community found his foreign policies horrific. The fiscal conservatives looked at his first budget, were terrified, and then cried themselves to sleep in the corner after the second, the third, and the fourth one. The business community had a falling out with him over COVID. He wouldn't take any of their advice, and by the time we got to like May, he's like, I'm done, I don't care. And any federal action on the virus basically stopped. He drove them out of the party. He campaigned against them. But he also brought in some other factions. The unions liked the anti-free trade position. The Catholics had a split, with about a third of them going more secular and 2/3 almost becoming evangelical. And the Hispanics, people forget the Hispanics are among the most socially conservative groups in the United States. And 3rd and 4th generation Hispanics define themselves as white, and they are the most anti-immigration group on the entire American political spectrum. They love the idea of the wall. They became Republicans. Today, this is what the Republican coalition looks like. It is custom made for the culture war, but it can't read a map and it can't do math. The adults in the room, as we've thought of them, are gone. Trump melon scooped them out of the party structures. He kicked them out of the White House. He campaigned against them in Congress, and he removed them from the Republican Party apparatus. They're gone. I don't want to say that they can't come back, but it's going to be a serious uphill slog. On the left, Biden did the same thing to the hard left. Now, part of this is that Obama really hated the term woke and everything that it stood for, and he came back from retirement to campaign against it. A big part of it, I think, is Kamala Harris. I know that a lot of people on the right think she's this ultra-liberal. She was a freaking district attorney. She put a lot of people in jail. Her first trip down to Central America, she threatened everybody. She is more to the right on law and order issues than Republicans from the Watergate era. And the left hates her for it. Now, what that means is that these people and that guy are more hated among the Democratic institutionalists than the Republicans are. They've been pushed out of the committees. They've been pushed out of decision-making within the party. They particularly loathe Bernie Sanders because he just keeps campaigning as a Democrat and muddling the water so they can't get a good candidate. But if you look at where the decisions are actually being made, it's a seismic shift from what the Democratic Party looked like 10 and 15 years ago. We're in a situation today where at Commerce, Transport, State, FTC, we have people with actual business experience, more business experience than the Trump cabinet. This isn't Obama 3.0, where the combined cabinet only had 5 years of private sector experience. This is a business-minded group. Left-leaning, of course. Are they redefining what the left means? Of course. So if you're opposed to their policies, that's fine. But don't think for a second that they're making this up as they go. They've actually trained for this for the last 12 years. The opposite is happening on the right. If you had told me 10 years ago that the Republican Party would have been unable to purge itself of not just vehement racists and accused sex traffickers and people who want to bring automatic weapons onto the floor of the Capitol, but to have a former president who's not just still politically active, but is actively campaigning against other Republicans rather than going after the Democrats, I would have laughed, because the Republicans were the party of adults. The adults are gone. Today's Republican Party, the last time I saw this internationally, was in Venezuela in the early 2000s. The Venezuelan Socialist Party, specifically. When internecine warfare and the willingness to use state power and even state violence against their political foes, not just across the political spectrum, but within their own institution, ripped the country apart. Now, I don't think we're going down that road, but I think the Republican Party is. The Republican Party can no longer claim to be the party of morality, ethics, foreign policy, fiscal prudence, or rule of law. And the political faction in the United States that cares about rule of law the most is that one. Donald Trump and his allies are now campaigning against the business community and the military. That will reshape American politics for the next generation. Now, it's not done. It's not gelled. We are 5 years into what is usually a 10 to 12-year transition. And this is not our first one. This is our 7th one. We will get through this. It will be loud. It will be messy. It will be uncomfortable. But we've done this before. But I've got 2 concerns. Number one, short term. We're probably, some version of this is going to settle within the next year, because that's the time frame for us selecting candidates for the primaries for the midterms. And if Trump and his allies dominate that process, he will bring to the fore a series of absolutely unelectable candidates across the country, and that will be most likely the end of the party in its current form. Some version of this happened to the Democrats in the last transition, and they were out of power for 12 years. Too soon to know for sure, but if you feel strongly about this one way or the other, now is the time to start getting involved in politics, because it's almost too late. Second problem, longer term. Like I said, this is the 7th time we've done something like this. On 3 of the 6 that came before, the people in the political middle became so disenchanted with the process that they just checked out. And they left it to the wackadoos on both sides to make all the decisions, and we got into wars on 3 of the 6. I'd rather not do that. Maybe that's just me. Although if we could do like a Spanish-American war, that was a lot of fun, so who knows? Okay. If you look at what's going on, the Democrats are, well, the Biden Democrats specifically, are making a bid for including the business community in their coalition. And if you look at who's at the helm and who's in the cabinet, they're not being sloppy about it. The president gets to appoint about 8,000 people. Unlike Trump, who never even appointed half of them, Biden is already like 3/4 of the way through, and he's only appointed 1 person from the hard left to any position at all. The business community has noticed that. That, in theory, is the new Democratic Party. But again, it has not gelled yet. So love it or hate it, now's the time. All right. Dare we take questions on politics? How much time we got? 5 minutes. Holy crap. Okay. You guys want me to talk about Iran real quick? People get hopped up on Iran. Okay, we'll make it quick. Okay, this is Rassi. He's the new president. He just got his new job last month. He was railroaded in. Everybody else was basically told they couldn't run. This was the conservatives making a power play. Not a desperate one, not a stilted one. They have completely taken over. So any meaningful dissension that you thought there might have been within Iran society, which could allow for regime change, no. It's like that game is over for at least the next 20 years. Now, Rassi specifically is, well, he's not shy. You guys remember back in 1988 when information leaked out that they were hanging people from forklifts, like 30,000 of them? That's him. Been in the judiciary since then, loves to execute people. Remember the Green Revolution from a few years ago? Yeah, he's the guy who executed them. So there is like no light between him and the clerical establishment, or especially the supreme leader. So the people of that cut are fully in charge of all institutions of government and have either eliminated everyone or intimidated them into doing nothing for the foreseeable future. Does that mean that I think Iran's about to cause us trouble? Absolutely not. 4 things. 1, Trump, the maximum pressure campaign worked, crushed the economy. And the people in the Biden administration who were talking about maybe regenerating some sort of nuclear deal, this is not the Obama administration. Now, what happened under Obama is these people who wanted a deal brought, and let me back up. So the people who came up with the idea of the deal back under Obama's term said that, if we want to leave the Middle East, we have to do one of 2 things. Number 1, we have to nuke the whole place to a glow so it never causes a problem again. Or number 2, we have to establish a regional balance of power so they keep each other occupied so we don't have to worry about it. So unless, Mr. President, you want to send about 1,000 nuclear weapons into the Middle East, you just hope that they all go off and one doesn't get lost. You need to bring Iran back in some way so it can balance the other players. That was the crux of the deal. So Obama heard it, thought it was great, but then he took the deal plan from the people who came up with it and gave it to his team of incompetents. The people who came up with the deal, they are now Biden's team. That's Sullivan. That's the new Secretary of State. And so they knew that what was going on under Obama was dumb. They saw the mistakes that were made. They realize that Donald Trump changed the game with his sanctions program, and that's where they're starting from. These are smart people. Second, here we have a religious map. So this dark green, that's primarily Iran. This is the Shia. For the last 20 years, the Iranians have shattered everything to the west, Iraq and Syria specifically. They're basically stateless areas. They're in collapse. And the Iranians have lost control of it because Iran stirred up sectarian tensions. But every group that Iran worked through was in the minority. Well, the majority's pissed. We've already seen a lot of Iranian agents just getting killed in the streets. They've lost control of all this. It's become complete chaos. Second, we left Afghanistan. Closed down Bagram last week. We'll be completely gone within a month. Before 2001, before September 11th, back in 1999, the Iranians almost invaded Afghanistan, wiped out the Taliban. We talked them out of it. Whether that was a good idea or not, we can leave to history. But the Taliban and the Shia hate each other more than words can convey. And while Americans are going, oh, no, the Taliban's coming back. Oh my God, they're so scared. So scared. There are already 3 million Afghan refugees in Iran, and that's in good times. Their economy can't take another million, much less the 10 that are likely to come. And that's before you consider the Saudis, who are chilling on their side of the desert that the Iranians can't cross, just throwing money and gasoline into every problem the Iranians have. Iran is discovering the same thing that the Russians are discovering. You remove the Americans from the equation and you have to deal with your neighborhood yourself. And that ends badly. So I got to talk about Russia real quick because I love this photo. Russia has spent the last 50 years stirring up trouble for the United States, especially since we went into Iraq and Afghanistan. But now that we're leaving and now that we're not really even interested in Europe anymore, they're realizing that the game really has changed. They've tried to get the US out of things for the last 70 years. They were the target of the Cold War. And now that they're getting what they want, they realize, oops. And now that we're gone, they all have to think for themselves. They all have to act for themselves. And because the US always had its finger in 1,000 different pies, we could never focus fully on Russia. But the Finns can, and the Swedes, the Japanese, the Germans, and the Poles. So they've gone from dealing with one distracted superpower to 30 hyper-vigilant middle powers. And their demography is collapsing. They will never have more skilled workers than they have now. And it's going to get worse in every single year. They haven't trained a full crop of engineers in 30 years. That means their youngest full cadre are now in their late 50s. He will be the last president of Russia, and we will all live to see it. Okay. The Russian state hacking capacity is limited. Most of the hacking that comes out of the former Soviet Union is crime syndicates, and there's a very official truce between the state and the syndicates. So it's basically, as long as you don't go after Russian assets or do things against Russians in general, you can go wherever you want. When the Colonial Pipeline was hacked, he got very scared. This was taken the day that the Colonial Pipeline was hacked, because he realized that that was probably too far. The United States' unofficial security policy in cyberspace is, as long as nobody dies in the United States, we're probably not going to do anything. But the US has more offensive hacking capacity than the rest of the world combined. Like, have any of you ever met a former hacker? No? That's because the NSA recruits them from prison. They go to Washington, they work for the NSA, they just hack people all day. So when Biden had his one-on-one with Putin, he did something that was very Russian. He said, you know, we just had this Colonial Pipeline hack. It was awful. It shut down the East Coast for days. I mean, how would it feel if your pipelines that gathered fuel from your oil fields where you have no storage? What if they were hacked and they went down? You wouldn't have any place to put the oil. The pipelines would explode. Wouldn't that be awful? Now, I don't know who wrote that for Biden, because that's not his style. I'm hoping it was Jake Sullivan. He's the new NSA. He's like 12, total protege. But Putin's got some decent advisors, certainly better than Obama ever did, but, you know, high bar. Anyway, the point is that the rules of the game have changed, and the Russian playbook is now 40 years out of date. And they don't have the institutional capacity to pivot, in my opinion. Yes? If you border them, certainly. Different hemisphere. I'm not too worried. Both of these countries have far bigger fish to fry close to home, especially if the United States is not playing. The last thing you would want to do if the US was withdrawn and you're dying is throw a stick at us, because our sticks are bigger and they've got better range, and they are far more dependent upon the smooth flowing of commerce than we are. So we can easily interdict whatever we want anywhere, and they can't protect it. So don't bring us into the war unless you feel you have no choice. I'm not a financial advisor, so take this for what it is. I look for things that are demographically driven, US-based, and ideally energy intensive and exportable. Because those are things where all of the competitive advantages of the United States stack up. You get rule of law, you're exposed to the shale revolution, it's cheap power prices, it's demographically driven, so you know demand will be stable. And as the global system breaks down, if it's exportable, there'll be a good market for it. So that's food processing, that's petrochemicals and plastics, that's water processing and relocation. Industries kind of in that category. How about what? I don't know what that is. Okay, I'll be sticking around a little bit extra in case you guys had questions that you were too shy to ask in front of other people. Oh, there's one more. Okay. I'm a fiscal conservative, so I'm one of those people that's completely politically homeless right now. People who are fiscal conservatives have lost the last 9 presidential elections. We doubled the deficit under W, we doubled it again under Obama, and then we doubled it again under Trump. And if Biden keeps on his current track for just another 6 months, he'll have doubled it again. So we're screwed. We being fiscal conservatives. But the long term, I gotta get him off of there, sorry. Like I'm being watched even when he's scary. Yeah, we don't need that. Okay. We've been the most conservative of all the major powers in terms of expanding the monetary base. We have the highest demand for our currency of any of the others. Even though our deficits have exploded, they're nothing compared to what's going on in China in the corporate world, or Japan in the government world, and Europe's only very shortly behind both of them on both. So in terms of the big players, it's just us. It used to be us and the Brits, but then they couldn't figure out what they wanted out of Brexit, and they printed currencies like 25% of GDP in like a year and a half before the financial crisis, during Brexit, and again under COVID. So it's just the dollar, that's it. And as long as that is the case, we've got three things going for us. Number one, our economy, our demography is aging most slowly of all the developed countries, and Mexico the most slowly of all the developing countries. We're together. So all these problems that everybody else has to wrestle with when it comes to economics, we have at least another 30 years. At time. Which means, number two, we are going to be the primary destination for capital flight the world over now, much less when the world starts to crack. Foreigners like T-bills, the safest investment there is. So I don't think we're going to have a problem financing. Third, because relative to the other powers, our debt is relatively low, we can monetize a fair amount without risking anything. So let's assume we can continue with 2.5% to 3% growth for the next 20 years, which I think is reasonable, especially since we're going to like 12% this year. That's $800 billion. 3% of that, 3% of GDP is $800 billion. That's how much we can monetize without increasing our relative death load. That's some pretty good elbow room. So I'm not too worried. Now, if we had stuck with Bill Clinton, or I phrased that wrong, if we had stuck with Bill Clinton's fiscal plans, the national debt would be zero, and we would have already saved up enough money to pay for the entirety of the baby boomer retirement. So there is an opportunity cost, and it is not small, but it's nothing compared to the risk that faces the rest of the world.
Peter, thank you so much.